Good evening. Welcome to the Farming Podcast brought to you by Private Property. My name is Mbali Wogo, and welcome for joining us this Tuesday evening. I almost forgot. I was about to say Thursday evening. Clearly, I'm rushing into Q2 already, but welcome for joining us this Tuesday evening. Today's show is a bit interesting because we get to speak to someone who's build their career within the agricultural sector, but doing something slightly different, not being a farmer, not being a marketer, but we are speaking to an agri-journalist / photographer who's also had an agribusiness within the agri-value chain. So we're going to get some insights into the different or alternative farming methods that are available to ensure that our beautiful sector that we all dearly love, which is the agriculture sector, remains sustainable for the long term. I think it's important to contributing towards food security, but at the same time being sustainable. I just want to say that before we introduce our guest, please continue to follow us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You would find all the information and the weekly posters of our Private Property Farming podcast on our social media. Not forgetting the other shows that we have on our channel as well, relating to property, whether you're a first-time home buyer, whether you're interested in property investments, or whether you'd like to see new show houses, openings of new properties, etc. Private Property, and especially our YouTube channel, has got you. So if you miss any of our weekly shows, you can obviously catch the repeats of those shows on our YouTube channel, on the various playlists that are available. Thank you once again, and continue to share, like, and comment on all our live conversations, most importantly because you get to speak to the guests that we have onto the show directly. But I'd like to introduce our guest today. Her name is Marinda Louw, and she is, like I said, an agri-journalist / photographer. Let's get to know about who she is and her role to the agricultural sector. Marinda, how are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me, and thank you to all your listeners and viewers. Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure this is going to be an interesting conversation, so I really can't wait. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, Marinda, please just give us a short introduction, what you've done in the agri-industry, especially with your compost making business, etc., and what you do now as an agri-journalist, etc.
Great question. Thank you very much. My composting or my agri career actually started as a packaging technologist. It was an export table grape company, exporting grapes to the EU and to Europe and beyond. And they wanted to convert from conventional farming to organic farming. So the farm, and it was very sandy soil. So what needed to be done, and especially in organic farming, is that you need to build the soil structure and add organic matter. And the best way to do that is composting. So I was sent on a composting course to Austria, and I completed the composting course there, and then I started with Eddie Rehlinghuis. We started Reliance Compost, which is now a national composting company providing organic compost to quite a few farms and landscapers and so on. So that basically was the base also of organic farming and sustainable farming, is the compost. And then eventually I actually started writing about composting and organic farming, and that led to a career in journalism. It took me to Media 24, to U Magazine and Huisgenoot, and then freelancing and event writing, agricultural articles on anything ranging from quinoa farming to goat farming and alternative farming systems in South Africa.
Wow. So, but what does alternative farming systems mean? Are we talking about changing soil and rather farming in compost, or the new term or kid on the block is hydroponically, etc., using growing medium, etc. This is regarding into crop production, but maybe moving on to livestock, what are some of the alternative farming methods? But if you could just explain that concept broadly so we could understand.
I think alternative farming is looking at historical or conventional farming, but looking at it from a different angle, or farming better or smarter. It can also mean alternative farming systems such as vertical farming. If you live in high density areas and you don't have land surface, that you farm vertically. Rooftop farming. We see that beehives are being kept on top of skyscrapers. So people farming in water, aquaponics, hydroponics, people farming oysters, abalone in seawater, kelp, and then also freshwater farming. So alternative farming is not only looking at conventional farming and doing it differently in terms of organic, but it could also be totally different farming systems,
What are some of the upsides and downsides of having to explore alternative farming systems? You mentioned, for example, instead of farming like the old traditional ways, people can now farm vertically. It sounds very fancy and technical. Does it come at a high price, etc.? You spoke about bees being kept in skyscrapers. What type of infrastructure and investment is required in that, and who looks after the bees at the top of the skyscrapers? You know what I mean? So what are the pros and cons of alternative farming systems?
Well, the reason for alternative farming is that the old or historical ways of farming is not working anymore. You see that conventional farmings, they need to add more chemicals, they need to increase the dosages, but also our export markets are starting to demand less and less chemical sprays, and the standards are very, very high in terms of what, for example, fruit farmers are allowed to use and spray on the apples and pears and citrus that goes to international markets. So from the one hand, there's a demand from customers to reduce chemical and other input, and also it becomes costly. But also we need to look at our resources, our water and soils being diminished. So from that point of view, we also need to look differently, or look for alternative ways of farming. So there's pressure from both sides, both from nature and the resources we have available, and then the market itself that demands that we look differently to how we farm. And then also we need to develop new markets. We want to start farming different products. We need more bees to pollinate the more almond trees and blueberries that are being planted in South Africa. So you find that from one industry, another industry grows, and you also find that farmers need to diversify even more in terms of the product range that they have available. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke about, from your answer, you've also just alluded to, the reason why alternative farming methods are critical is that they help us preserve our natural resources, and that being water and soil, which is such big components into the farming industry. And you've, I think, mentioned that you've just done a bit of work or research around water and soil. Can you share something about those two elements for us?
I think the two is very interrelated to each other. The example that I mentioned was the same. When you give nutrients to the plant and water, if there's not a good soil structure, your water and your nutrients will leach out. So what you need to do, and what South Africa needs to do, is build the organic matter content in the soil. What that means basically is adding composting in the soil or on top of the soil, mulching. That not only helps with the evaporation of moisture from the soil. It prevents weeds growing in terms of the mulch that you put on top. But it also helps to create a soil structure. It creates aggregates, if that's the word I can use, that help to maintain soil in the moisture in the water. So your soil quality and soil structure goes hand in hand with the type and the amount of water that you use. And then, yes, but it depends on which soil type you use, and also which crop, and how you manage your water, and what type of irrigation. So there's many other parameters in terms of water usage that one can look at to reduce the amount of water that one uses.
Yeah. Going back to compost, Marinda, because you ran a business within the composting, and I suppose some of the key insights that you're sharing as well are, real life or lived experiences within your compost business. And you mentioned that, you sold the compost to farmers as well as private individuals in their home gardens. And I'm just thinking, as a farmer who's just farming on vast stretches of land, that wants to farm more sustainably, I'm sure compost might not work for him or her, unless they try different methods to preserve soil, etc. But do you think for professionals who are farming, in their backyard gardens, individuals who are growing food systems in their backyard gardens, etc., how can they preserve their compost time and time again? Because sometimes as a farmer myself, I get queries from individuals saying, oh, my crops died, what happened? And then, they'd send their picture. Or someone would say, I just bought a new house. I can never grow anything in this backyard garden. What's wrong with the soil? Is the soil too red or yellow or whatever the case is? And people sometimes need advice. So, for people then maybe who are not sure about their soil compositions and want to go into compost and maybe just do the two or mix the two in their private spaces, how can they preserve compost? How can they ensure that they can grow healthy food for their own individual or family consumption?
Sure, it's a lot of questions in one. In terms, I'll try and give you lots of answers as well. Okay. Composting and using compost is just one way of adding organic matter in the soil, or adding plant matter back into the soil, because you need to feed the microbes and the soil life that's inside the soil. You don't necessarily only have to use compost. You don't have to buy compost if you don't have it. But if you've got leaves or grass or weeds, you can use that. All of those are organic matter that you can put back in the soil. Something else in terms of crops dying and using companion planting, or making use of a system or method called companion planting, is also beneficial. Companion planting means that you plant certain plants next to each other. The one is the natural repellent of pests of the other. So it means that they attract certain insects that are predators of pests. And it also means some plants actually secrete stuff in their roots that actually help manage soil health. So companion planting is planting different plants together that are beneficial for the other one's growth or protection. So composting is one aspect of farming or soil health, but there's also other aspects such as using mulch. Mulch is a layer of organic matter, whether it's old leaves or grass or cuttings or whatever. So using that on top of the soil to prevent weed growth. That is, for example, that's another way of preventing moisture loss and preventing weed growth, using a mulch. And then companion planting, as I mentioned, it also attracts insects. That's important to reduce your insecticide input. What are the there's so many questions in one, but composting, you don't need, and composting is not always practical or viable in terms of cost for huge scale, huge farmers, yes, on commercial scale.
Thank you. Before I move on to the next question, I just want to encourage any of you watching at home this evening. We are joined by Marinda Louw, who's an agri-journalist slash photographer, and I suppose entrepreneur in the composting space, or agripreneur, should I say. And today we're talking about alternative farming methods. And earlier on, if you missed some critical points that she mentioned, is that she highlighted a few of examples of what alternative farming methods are. So if you missed the first part of the show, you could definitely catch it on our YouTube channel. But please comment, ask any questions that you have to Marinda that you want her to clarify, specifically on farming sustainably, on alternative farming methods, conventional farming, or organic compost. This show is for you. Marinda, I just want to find out, with your, now I'm just thinking with the farmer's hat here, with the composting business, and for people that are listening to you and maybe would want to try being in the composting industry or start their own compost business, and you mentioned the word organic in some examples that you explained, is every single compost in the composting business, is it 100% organic? So when you're going into the business, do you have to be certified organic? Because I know to be organically certified requires someone to go through a certification process of some sort.
I think we need to distinguish between organic farming and sustainable farming. Organic farming is it's when you go through a certification process to get a label that you can put in your product that gets sold as organic, an organic product in a retailer. So the retailer might have some standards, and there might be an organic body that might have standards, and then your product is certified organic. So it's to farm organically, more linked to a certification system. To farm sustainably is to look after the resources that you put in, whether it's looking at the chemical inputs. It's not necessarily an organic that you're not allowed to use sprays or insecticides or weed killers or so on, but it's the sustainable use of all your inputs. Something else I just want to mention, we're focusing on organic farming and composting and soil-based, but alternative farming systems could also involve farming in and with water, and that is aquaculture, which means your plant is physically in a liquid medium. It's physically hanging in water, so the roots are suspended in the water. And aquaponics is aquaculture. Actually, sorry, I'm wrong way, other way around. Is that you farm fish, or you farm crustacea or prawns or something. So it's water animals or water plants that's being farmed, or often in combination with plants, so that the nutrient-rich water of a fish, let's say, use that example, is then fed through to herbs and other plants, which then purify the water and use the nutrients, and then the purified water are filtered back to the animals, the fish. So it's a closed loop system, not always closed loop, but it's a water-based system. So alternative farming systems could entail farming on land, but it can also entail farming with or in water.
Wow. So moving on to something else, I think maybe could also come much closer to home for our audience this evening, is that also you have like a non-conventional career, right? It's not a traditional line that one would pick up based on the skill set that you have, like photography, and you started writing first and then you moved into journalism, etc. What are some of the non-farming opportunities that exist in the agricultural sector, based on your experience and looking at how your career has also turned?
Excellent question. In terms of photography, what is interesting, when I was researching, writing articles for southafrica.co.za, I wrote about farming and agricultural commodities in South Africa, and that was translated into all 11 South African languages. It was a huge project, but the absence of good photos of South African farmers and South African products and South African commodities, that I realize is also a huge opportunity, that there's not a lot of images available, of trout cages, where trout are being bred, and things like millet in South Africa, in terms of non-agricultural opportunities within the agricultural sector, sure, there's a lot. I'm thinking of venues, wedding venues, training venues, if you want to train farm workers, how to prune, how to trim the hooves of your goats, that kind of training venues. I'm thinking of restaurants, coffee shops, farm stalls. Something else that's probably non-farming but definitely related to agricultural commodities is processing. I mean, if you've got a tomato farmer and your market is satisfied with or saturated with tomatoes, and you're sitting with tomatoes, then preserving those products is a secondary industry, whether you jam it, dry it, pickle it, further processing of agricultural products. Certainly agri-tourism is huge, and I think that's also in terms of people wanting to buy property. I think that could also be an option to look at, is how can I use this property also not only to farm but as a destination, probably a tourism destination. It could be people wanting to take part and see what happens on the working farm, but it might also be people wanting to escape the city and just experience fresh farm air. So there's so many aspects of agriculture that doesn't necessarily involve getting your hands dirty. And then evolving into other value-added products and offerings that's related to a farm.
Yeah, I like that example that you brought in with your photography, that, you found a gap pretty much where you can't just, I can attest to the fact that there aren't so many pictures of South African farmers or farming, the ones that you do find online are always just mostly repetitive, or it's a hand holding a cell phone, or when you're talking about farming, it's just a tractor in the field. But you could see that these destinations are non-African destinations and more so non-South African. And so with your photography, what did that entail? Were you just taking photos around different farms? Were you traveling and finding very beautiful destinations that exist within the in South Africa and taking pictures of that? So infusing it with a bit of tourism and farming. What type of pictures did you send, and where did they land up?
It's interesting what kind of photos get sold, but also what kind of photos are people commenting on, and what people want to see is for example, one series of articles I wrote was how to clip the hooves of your goat, and why it's important to trim the hooves of a goat. But no one understands, or not many people understand, how important it is for a goat to have the hooves regularly clipped, because he needs to walk far and tread very securely to get to where he wants to go. It's a climbing animal. So I took photos of someone trimming, cutting step by step the hooves of a goat. Certainly not a glamorous, wasn't a glamorous day, but it was fantastic. And then another one, for example, was blueberry farming, is how blueberries are grown, that it grows in peat. It's it's imported. They grow in pots, they don't grow in soil. Yeah. The nutrient goes through the water in dripper systems into the individual buckets or pots. Mm-hmm. And then the different varieties, how it's been picked, how it's been packaged, and also just being outside, eating directly from the plant and chatting to people while they're working it. A fantastic experience. So I think we don't see enough of farmers and real life farmers and what they do and the good stories, that might be simple stories, it might be spectacular stories, but the stories of people farming. And there's so many different ways of doing things and alternative ways of doing things, and we can learn so much from each other.
Oh, wow. I think just to sum up our conversation today, we spoke about some non-farming opportunities. And also earlier on in our conversation, you mentioned different or various alternative farming systems or methods. For anybody listening this evening and is also maybe thinking of alternative farming systems, specifically in the South African context, what opportunities are available for a new entrant wanting to come into the agriculture industry to specifically farm? What alternative farming systems are available within the South African context that someone can take advantage of?
Sure, that's a good question. I think if you're a non-farmer and you need to decide on you want to farm, what do you want to farm? That will determine what the market wants. You're not going to farm something that you won't get sold. So determining what the market wants. If there's a huge market for organic apples and you're sitting in an area where there's organic, where it's suitable for growing fruit, and you've got bridging capital for 5-6 years until your apples become viable, then that's something you need to consider. So you look at the environment, you look at your soil type, you look at where your farm is situated, you also look at what the market wants. And then that will determine what kind of crop or livestock or what farming system you're going to use. If you want to farm cucumbers, but the area is probably not viable, then you need to think of an alternative farming system and then think probably on tunnels, using tunnels, farming cucumbers in tunnels. So I think there's a lot of parameters that one needs to look at when you want to enter the farming. But it's certainly you want to farm something that you want to sell at the end of the day, and then therefore you need to be close to a market. You need to be able to provide the right product to the market, but you also need to look at your soil type, what kind of soil, what kind of quality of water, and do you have enough water? And then work around your resources that you have available and make sure that you utilize them sustainably.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So without, wasting too much of your time, if just for anybody also that's interested and wants to know, where you're writing your articles, etc., what are some of the publications where you're writing about alternative farming methods? Do you have a blog or where can we find some of your information?
Cool, thank you. I wrote quite a few articles on for a company called southafrica.co.za. Articles range from quinoa farming, prawn farming, goat farming, medicinal plants, indigenous fruits, indigenous vegetables. Goodness, I can't even remember what I wrote about. Guava farming, fig farming, I don't know, there's so many. I was part of an agricultural team, and all those articles are translated into all 11 South African languages. The company is called southafrica.co.za, and under each article there would be a choice of languages, so you click on the language and you read the article in the language of your choice.
Wow, thank you so much, Marinda, for your time this evening. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure that our guests our audience did too. I've just got 2 comments to read for you that said, from Lisa Kaba, saying, thanks for letting us know about the latest in farming. And Zamila just saying, greetings, family. I'm sure they're watching the Private Property podcast right now and our conversation. So thank you, Marinda, for your insights and for obviously sharing that information about where you have those alternative farming articles that we could catch up on.
Great stuff. Thank you, Mbali. I had fun. Thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thank you. If you missed tonight's episode, you'll catch it on our YouTube channel on Private Property under the Farming Podcast playlist. Today, we're joined by Marinda Louw, who is an Agri-journalist journalist and a photographer, and also an agripreneur, I'd like to say, who had her own composting business. But most importantly, the crux of our conversation today was about alternative farming systems, the different methods in which you can begin farming, thinking about your natural resources, things like climate change, being able to still produce, but really farming more sustainably in this in the environment that is that you're faced in, or that specifically speaks to what type of commodity you want to farm. And so, yeah, that was our show this evening on alternative farming methods. But thank you again for your comments and for engaging with us. It's always nice to know that you are watching, and to send a little shout out to myself or the guests. Thank you so much for your support. That's it from me tonight, and I bid you farewell for this evening. Take care. See you soon.
Thanks, Mali.